Aleida, in your poetry we find your passion for words. You are a translator. I always see yourself like surrounded with dictionaries. We also find humor, eroticism, but in many poems there is this contemplative quality, almost like a mystic-like quality. And I think it's related to your relationship with nature, your garden. Could you talk about your connection with mystic poetry?
I think my first introduction to what I consider mystic poetry were the Sufis, and that was through Robert Bly's translations. He translated Kabir way back in the 60s, and Rumi, and I have all the early, before he became so popular that even Madonna made CDs with him, and Deepak Chopra and all that stuff. Rumi was this secret that no one knew about, and his poems would come out in little letterpress volumes, and I have them all the way back. And then of course, then later Coleman Barks translated Rumi, and he has the big collection of Rumi's poems. And I always related to that. They sound a little aphoristic, and I kind of like that, very compressed and philosophical. But I always felt a connection to nature, so when I started reading the Sufi poetry, and I think if I had to choose a quote-unquote religion, I would be a Sufi.
In your poetry, there are many references to the botanical language. You were very specific with the names of the plants, the trees, and as I said, this almost meditative quality. One of the best examples, I think, is a poem called Elysian Twilight. And since you are an official poet of Elysian Heights, maybe you can start with reading that poem.
Okay. My sink looks east toward what are called the Baxter stairs, and it's my street climbs the hill as stairs, not as a street. And that was because in the early part of the century there were trolley cars, so people needed the stairs to come down to the main streets to catch the trolley. I look at that and it becomes me in many ways, the things that I look at. When I first started writing, I thought of windows, because it seemed like I was always looking at a window, and I was identifying with whatever was happening out the window from my earliest poems. And so one day I'm there at the sink, I look up and this poem came to me. I actually had to abandon my dishes and get a notebook and start writing. 30 seconds later, head bowed to sudsy water, and I would have missed it. The pale mauve stain that seeps up the hem of the hill like spilled rosé would have evaporated, and I would have seen only evening's indigo dress rent with stars. But something makes me look up from 23 years at the same sink and catch daytime's ordinary pine, shedding its quotidian pretense, entering left with a dark cloak and serrated eyebrows. At right, the ineptly pruned cottonwood's few emergent leaves fill into a gown in the fading light, and it glides in, holding a gloved hand. Twilight, the dance these trees have begun between them, hovers at the edge of taking form, or losing form, becoming the evanescent portrait between the vases. The serpentine jewels of the Baxter stairs dangle from its darkening throat. A shadow mockingbird streaks to the highest spot to release its song.
Thank you. I love the ending of the poem. I believe in 5th grade you wrote short stories, like a mystery story.
Yes.
And then you encounter poetry as a reader with, I think in junior high or high school, one of the many poets was Ferlinghetti, I believe.
Right.
So did you start writing poetry at that time?
Yes, I began in junior high in earnest. Yes, okay. I still have them. They're terrible, but they serve as a good grounding for my later work.
And when did you call yourself a poet? When did you say, oh, I am a poet?
That one is very hard, because even after I won, I was 27, 28, around there when I won the NEA, and it was the first time I had applied. It was very difficult, to be able even to apply, because you had to have like 20 poems published in 5 years and so many, literary journals. So you had to be producing a lot and have evidence of that. So, but by the time that I had, reached 27, I had all those credits, so I submitted. I didn't know, what would happen. I was working at the LA County Museum as an editor at the time, and suddenly one October I got the letter that said I got the NEA, and I thought, friends said, well, now you can call yourself a poet. But I didn't feel that I could yet. I felt like I hadn't earned it. And most people do feel that when they get a large award like that very few people get, that then you can officially claim that identity. But I have too much respect for poetry. I felt like I hadn't grown up yet. I hadn't become a poet. And it really, I think it probably took another 20 years for me to officially call myself a poet, and that was when my book came out. When I saw that ISBN number on my copyright page, I felt like I was part of the conversation.
It was a very successful book. I think you won the Catherine Morton Prize in Poetry and also the Penn Center 2000 Literary Award in Poetry. But I think even before the success of the book, you felt that you were typecast. You have a wonderful essay called The Glass Cage, where you explain that you are allowed to be visible if you say the things that other people want you to say. And I think I want to quote you. In this essay, you say that you are allowed to talk about your exile, your mother, or your childhood in Cuba. Basically, you were a three-note piano. I think your work has shattered this glass cage, but I would like you to talk a little bit why it was so difficult for the perception of your work to be expanded or to be open.
It was an accident, the Cuban Revolution. It was an accident that I was born in Cuba. It's an accident that I am, Hispanic and lesbian. So why should I be held to something that I had no control over? And why should those identities be constricted when white writers, white, non-minority, just like the mainstream people, get to write about anything they want. They can contemplate absolutely anything. Then I started noticing that friends of mine in Cuba were able to write about anything because there they were just writers. Yes, I did feel frustrated with that. And when I learned that there was a book coming out called Sleeping with One Eye Open, Women Writers Address, Survival or something like that, I submitted my essay to it because I thought that it was speaking to my own attempt to survive as an artist outside of these boxes and glass cages. But a lot of people take advantage of those things. And you said, I have shattered that glass cage, but I haven't. I just got back from the AWP conference. That glass cage was so present there, even though my workshop was about shattering the glass cage. And it was like the 20th anniversary of my essay, and where are we now with this? Yeah. We're still there, because now young people think they're activists if they play out a stereotype. It's a very strange thing. I don't quite understand it, but if they are like super, super Latino or super, super gay or super, super whatever it is, and they play out those stereotypes, they think they're being activists. And I'm saying, no, you're playing into the conventional. Now you're expected to be that. So that's not being an activist. An activist is saying, screw you, I'm going to write my work. That's what an activist is. You do it outside of convention, outside of acceptance. So I don't think I have shattered it, but hopefully I've made a few dings in the glass.
Painting has a strong presence in your poems, and I think many people, if they read some of your poems, may believe that you are a painter. Why don't you read a poem that I think is very connected to your painting passion? It is called "Why I Would Rather Be a Painter."
I also like to point out that it's a double Petrarchan sonnet in iambic pentameter, and I chose that form because I thought, if I talked about this issue, I have so many feelings about it, I could just wander off forever, get really tangential. So I needed to have something that would keep me in line, not be able to go too far and give me the underpinnings of those end-line rhymes. But I use slant rhymes, so you can't always hear cat, sat, mat. You can't always hear it that way. There's slant rhymes, so they kind of like the enjambment goes on to the next, line like that. So, but it's a double Petrarchan sonnet, and the reason, usually in a sonnet, 2/3 of the way down, there's that turn where it changes. Well, my turn happened in the second. In the second part of the double sonnet. Why I would rather be a painter. We have our disagreements about paint, the use of words, and which art is the least corrosive on the heart, which makes the best amusement right for pure escape. No taint of childhood's mess to hold you back with paint, I say. A tube of Naples yellow rests apart from cruelty or cliché. No beast inhabits daubs of phthalo green, but hint at even such a word as love, and I am bent like Sisyphus beneath the stone. I'd rather scrub the fungus from the tiles. Give me a brush, some pigment, and my eyes. I'll render what I would have left alone with words, the peace inside spreading for miles. Of course, this is provided I could paint, which is the sort of lie that language tells, and further illustrates the kind of hell that lurks, a tarry pit beneath bright sentences. It is that thing, that sense for rent of words that I despise. Dictators dwell in palaces of words, while peasants swill the backwash of those lies. Time someone went and told the emperor of words he's nude, or better yet, would simply burn his speeches and force him to take up the brush. This pitch of mine has dictatorial tones, but made of nobler stuff, I hope, if it teaches that those who can do, and those who can't, bitch.
You started publishing in your 20s, I believe. So you have a big poetry production. You also have written essays and prose poetry. Do you think that throughout the years you have approached poetry the same way?
I think the initial impulse is the same. I'm moved by something. It sort of turns around in there. It starts like, sort of like Velcro starts picking up lint. And
oh, that's a great image.
No. And then it picks up lint, and then I realize that the lint means something, and I start picking the lint out of the Velcro and putting it down on the page. Okay. I mean, if I can use a weird metaphor. But it gathers itself, and I don't know where it's going. Sometimes when I wrote a poem in Spanish for my mother, it came intact while I was in the garden. It just, yeah. I was my own amanuensis, you know. I was just taking dictation to what was coming in. And occasionally poems have come like that. But usually it comes from that sort of meditative place that you observed, because I'm listening to something that's coming very far away. And sometimes I can't hear what it's about. As it gets closer, I sort of hear what it's about. And then I might be editing something else, and a phrase or something from the thing I'm working on professionally for someone else in a job, that a phrase will jump up or a word will come up, and I will go to the dictionary to look up that word, and something there next to it will trigger the thing I'm thinking about. So it's exploration, and I just stay curious. I just stay open and curious, and I don't know if anything will work once I put it down on the page, but I just put it down.
You write mostly in English, but you also have written poems in Spanish, and you also code switch between Spanish and English in your work. So what's your relationship with Spanish in your poetry production?
I didn't write in Spanish until after I had gone through transcendental meditation. And that is because when I meditated, I found myself, I'd come here at the age of 9, and let's see, how old was I? I was 23, I think, when I took up meditation. And when I would meditate, these words would surface, and they wouldn't sometimes make very much sense. But nevertheless, I would write down these things. Those surreal or nonsensical phrases that first surfaced really bubbled up. Were words I didn't even know that I knew in Spanish. Like, I didn't remember them from my childhood. They came intact, and I had to look them up to find out if what I was thinking they meant was true. When my parents arrived from Cuba, the foster family had forbidden me to speak Spanish because they thought it would help me learn English. So I could understand everything they were saying, but I couldn't make anything
you couldn't produce the language?
No, I just couldn't make anything come out. And in the months after they came, and I moved in with them away from the foster family, I would go, what do you call that? What do you call that? What's the name of that?
Wow.
How come the verb is like this? How come it doesn't end like that?
I see.
Because, you know, there are irregular verbs. And like when you're a little kid, it's like people do that in English too, the way that kids end words funny because they think all of them should.
Yeah, you want to follow the rule.
Exactly, and you don't know there are irregular verbs. So I started there, you know, like with the relearning Spanish. And then I worked as my parents' translator, basically, everything, landlords, banks, So
you are the interpreter for them.
Exactly. So I became a natural translator in the world, and then I started moving out into the world, doing translation for other people and like that. And in my own work, though, it didn't surface until Transcendental Meditation. Then I went to Beyond Baroque, and I heard Victor Valle read a poem for his girlfriend there, and it was bilingual. And I sat at the back, I actually stood at the very back of the room, and at the end, I don't even remember what the poem was about or what it contained, but at the end I thought, which parts had I heard in English and which parts had I heard in Spanish? And it was such a weird sensation inside my head. I just liked that feeling. I couldn't pick out the parts because I understood both of them.
Yeah.
So I went back and I was really sort of moved by it in a really weird linguistic way. And I thought, well, how do I talk about my childhood in Cuba? And especially that time when I was sick with bronchitis and I had to live at the Rosario Beach House with my grandmother. How do I talk about that? And I thought, back and forth. And that like back and forth of like English and Spanish began to mimic the beach, you know, the water coming in and going out. But I didn't want to repeat. I hate it when people do this in bilingual poetry, where they go, mi casa, my house. You don't need to say it. We understood mi casa. Very few people don't know what that means. The parts that were in English, I don't know if you've noticed this, are more cerebral, because I think that my mind is in English because I was educated in English, and my heart is in Spanish, so that if I ever say a tiny word in Spanish, it's like, ooh, a little bit of emotion starts coming up because there's so much emotion embedded in Spanish for me. So that bit, I wanted to bring that emotion up, but not to manipulate it, only when it rose naturally.
You have multiple publications and awards. Most recently, the 2019 COLA Fellowship is from the City of Los Angeles Cultural Affairs. William Moore, in the catalog for the COLA Awards, he talks about your work, and he says that she is able to defamiliarize the familiar in our lives. Do you recognize yourself in this description?
I wondered about that when I read that line. I think that he means that I take ordinary things and I take it to that mystic place that you mentioned, is that I see something extremely like those trees, you know, extremely quotidian, and then suddenly something magical comes in and they are transformed into dancing, you know, trees.
This COLA Fellowship was given to you to finish a project. Is the project the new manuscript Claroscuro? Is that right?
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about Claroscuro?
Claroscuro has been coming together for the last maybe 5-6 years or so. Little poems, kind of, I see it kind of like metal shavings around the magnet. I didn't know quite what it would be, but more as I started to see and started to group the poems according to like their feeling, I came up with the word in Spanish claroscuro, which is. It's funny that English doesn't have one. It only has the Italian one.
There's the Italian one, yes.
I know, chiaroscuro, you know. It's weird that English doesn't have one. So anyway, so I thought about that because it means so many things in Spanish. You know, for the word means, you know, sort of like nebulous and kind of mysterious. But for me, it meant things that were right next to each other. The very bright next to the very dark. And then that verge of vibrating, you know, space between the very light and the very dark.
There is one poem in that manuscript. It's called The Woman on the Plain, and I like it because I think it shows your sense of humor, and it may also show the role of a poet in society. It's a little bit like an ars poetica.
Yes, it is.
So do you mind reading The Woman on the Plain?
The woman on the plain didn't know who Pablo Neruda was when I mentioned him in passing. Pablo who? She asked. The Chilean poet? I ventured, thinking maybe she hadn't heard me over the din of flight. But her brow remained furrowed, her expression tinged with trepidation, as if she feared I would tell her more. And I did. I told her about his Nobel speech, Childhood and Poetry, where he recounts an experience of exchanging small gifts with the boy on the other side of a fence without ever seeing his face. He'd received a small sheep with faded wool whose wheels had escaped. All of this made it more authentic, I quote enthusiastically. In return, Neruda had passed his favorite possession, a resinous pine cone, through the hole. He never saw the hand again, and the toy sheep was later lost in a fire. But the mysterious exchange remained, indestructible, still giving light. That's what being a poet is like, exchanging gifts with others we don't know. I look at my seat companion through wet lashes, hoping for a knowing flicker in her eye. Oh, she says, a little uncomfortable, as if saying anything more might lead me to further revelations. I'm going to read my book now, she says. I nod and glance at the cover. A mystery or a romance, I can't tell. But I've passed along my gift, pushed poetry through the barrier of everyday, and settled back, satisfied. Later, she'll tell her husband about the strange woman on the plane, but as part of her story, she'll have to mention Pablo Neruda, whose name I made her type into her device. That one just came. I mean, I didn't realize I had been incubating that. I was working on something else, and all of a sudden it's like, the woman on the plane, and I rushed in and wrote it all down.
You were the founder and also the editor of Rara Avis magazine and books of Feather Press. This project started in 1977 and ended in 1984.
Yes.
What was the need of you to do this? Because it's an amazing project to do this.
Well, being young and stupid and having a lot of energy and having a lot of ideals, and I had already been involved in LA poetry. Bill Moore had published one of my first poems in Momentum magazine, and then he was seizing production of Momentum and going exclusively into Momentum Press, his books. So I thought, we need another literary magazine. Okay. And not only that, but I see people all around me, because I was already in writing groups that met once a week, writing excellent stuff, and they would submit it and would never get published. And I thought, why is this happening? And a lot of it was the Eastern bias against anything coming from California. If you had a tree in there, you were too much of a nature poet, that kind of thing. People think I started because I'm lesbian and I wanted to publish lesbians, and it wasn't that. It was that I wanted to publish people writing in LA. Los Angeles was my focus. That's why in everything around it was like a Los Angeles-based magazine. It didn't have any other political bent. However, I also wanted to represent everyone, men, women, lesbians, gay men, old people, young people, whatever it is, bilingual, anything, even visual artists, we included some of their work. All I wanted was for these poems and my magazine to reflect Los Angeles and to say, you may not think we exist, but here we are. And we may be a rara avis, but we're still in avis, And so, that's what I intended to do, was like to showcase and underrepresented writers, but mostly Los Angeles.
There's one section in your new manuscript, Claroscuro, is called Poems from the News. And I think they're fascinating poems. You talk about a woman that kills her husband with eye drops. You talk about a man's life saved by trash bags, and also a woman that can remember everything. I find these poems very expansive. I think they show your sense of humor. Somehow the voice feels very free. I'm not saying that there is less craft, but the poems feel very liberating. So I have a question, and is because the title of this section is Poems from the News, so how does the news become a poem?
That series began when I was pretty much incapacitated after my mom's death, and I also suffered a stroke. So I was catching things from the news that were triggering ideas, but I couldn't quite develop them, so I would write them down in a little notebook. And as I said, that thing of like, it starts accruing other language around it, like, little metal shavings. So when, like the Marilu Henner, one, I thought about my mother, of course, as I was writing it. But it was that thing of like remembering absolutely everything. Did I really want to remember absolutely everything? And that whole idea of like, is it good to remember absolutely everything? Is she hounded by all those memories? So it set me off on that. But every time I saw a news item, and there are of course, hundreds every single day. It seemed like a metaphor, like the young guy who jumped, from whatever 10 stories in New York. Of course, he hadn't figured out that there would be, a blizzard and then the trash trucks not being able to pick up the trash bags. So, humongous pile of trash bags saved his life. Like, come on. It's little things like that, unusual things that are bad but turn out to be good, or good but turn out to be bad,
Yes.
that lead me down these very, eccentric little...
Well, also it's in the claroscuro, also in the claroscuro territory. Like,
That's right.
It's the bright thing and the dark thing and
That's
together,
right.
and with the line in the center,
That's
as you
right.
explained before. So why don't we close with you reading this poem? It's called Marilu Henner. I don't know how to pronounce this. Probably Henner. Can't remember. That's the opening line.
Marilu Henner can remember every detail of her life. Scientists are studying this rare ability identified so far in only 12 people. Everyone is amazed and envious, but I wouldn't want to remember any more than I already do. Oh, if it were only the head those memories screened on the walls of. But remember in Spanish is recordar, which means to pass again through the heart. The exact inflection of hurtful words, the violent act, the loss of innocence. In fact, I wouldn't mind vacating half of what's been hoarded, sweeping out some crowded cells to make cavernous rooms for memorizing poetry or recalling every pore and blemish on my mother's animated face for hours, like a favorite film playing again in my heart.
Thank you very much, Aleida. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariano. It's been nice.